Now, the brief overview of Hurricane Florence here. We got some latest updates. We got hurricane force winds really getting close to the shore. The latest, we got one reading, Cape Lookout, gusting at 79 miles an hour. So the latest overview, look at these bands of hurricane force winds. They're making it on shore. So that's one of the bigger updates.
And can you talk about flooding? We just talked about like a few minutes ago about what regions seem to be in most trouble in terms of storm surge and flooding, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so the question is looking at some of the places vulnerable to that storm surge, and we've got several. You know, the storm surge is the leading cause of fatalities in the tropical systems, so that's why we spend so much time talking about it. You know, you look at even Charleston, 2 to 4 feet, and going up to the coast of South Carolina, 4 to 9 feet, but look at some of these values, 9 to 13, even the northern part of the coast of North Carolina, 4 to 9 feet. So those kind of places we're really concerned about, and I do have a graphic I'd like to show because I think we're already starting to see some of this water move in. We've been talking about places like New Bern for a while and talking about the Neuse River and also the Pamela Coast Sound. See, these rivers normally flow this direction, and when you have rainfall, the water flows out. In a storm surge situation, the water comes in and actually forces the water in the opposite direction. So it's not just the barrier islands, it literally piles up in these areas, and that's where we could see some large values of storm surge.
And can you talk about western North Carolina, sort of what people can expect there in Asheville and that region?
Yeah, just because you know, with this hurricane, some people think it's mainly along the coast, but you know, looking at Asheville, looking at places inland, still going to be torrential rainfall. So if you think about it, we do have some concentration of the rain along the coast, but look as far as Asheville, where Charlotte 6 to 10 inches, even Asheville can see 4 to 6 inches. But a really important point to make here is a lot of times you'll see higher amounts. You start seeing some of this rain stall, some of these rain bands as it moves northward. Some of these values could be much higher. Think about the terrain, think about all that rain, and that could spell very dangerous flash flooding.
And I think you were talking previously about how slow the storm is moving and how that's actually a bad thing. Can you explain why and what effects might come from that?
Yeah, you're talking about the question is looking at the slowness and how that impacts the hurricane. I tell you, it's an old saying that we have when we talk about these hurricanes. Large and slow is our nemesis because the impacts are compounded when these storms are large and slow. And we've been forecasting it to be slow for a while, and it's coming true. We're seeing it slow down. And if you think about this, you know, the 8 a.m. we're still right along the coast, 8 a.m. tomorrow. And with time, this is 8 a.m. Saturday. Think about that. So we're hardly any territory covered here in a long period of time. That means prolonged rainfall, prolonged high tides. Some people may even get some of those high tides a day or so later when the winds switch around. So that's what's really causing some of our problems and making the impacts even worse.
And can you give us the sort of the timeline? So 8 a.m. Friday is the landfall, and then how is the storm progressing? And I see it on your map, but can you explain that, please?
Yeah, so looking at the timeline for this and go through the whole evolution. So it looks like, you know, sometime overnight towards Friday morning, we'll have some sort of a landfall as a hurricane, but slowly progressing forward as we march forward. Right there, the last line I drew is 8 a.m. on Sunday. But think about this, that's 8 a.m. Monday, 8 a.m. on Tuesday. It's going to take time for this next system to come in to finally pull out this hurricane. So meandering slowly and eventually taking off with time as this next system carries it off. The problem is all this, you know, the remnants and what we have with Florence may be gone, but in the wake, we'll have river flooding. We'll have flooding that could potentially be in some areas for weeks.
And where will the landfall be specifically? Like which cities or major or small cities are we talking about?
Really, we're getting really close. I mean, in this case, it's really what we're trying to focus about is, you know, the landfall is one point, but let's think of it this way. You have the landfall, but the hurricane force winds being 70 miles away from it. Whether you're at the landfall or far away, you're still going to get hurricane force winds. So wherever that landfall is, we'll see with time that could vary, but the bottom line is anywhere near that landfall and outward, hurricane force winds, which is extremely dangerous.
And I know you've repeated this probably a dozen times today, but explain again to people why they shouldn't just be concerned about wind speeds and concerned about rain and everything else.
And the question is about why not to really focus on that category in the wind speed, but all about the impacts. And we do keep repeating it because it's so important. We hear people say, well, it's weakened, it's strengthened. We concentrate so much on the wind. When we close our eyes and we think about a hurricane, all we see is the wind. And the reality, 90% of the fatalities in tropical systems is indeed the water. So what we have to think about is the impacts. And that's what, it's not about the category. Don't focus on that wind necessarily, but think about the impacts, the large rainfall, the floods, and the storm surge, because that's what's hurting people. And if we take that into account, we can save a lot of lives.
And one last question, Charleston
Well, we could see some storm surge. There are 2 to 4 feet possible. So I think in these places, people really know where they're vulnerable to these values. But even looking at the rainfall amounts, Charleston is in an area that you could see some of that high rainfall. And I think it's really important because if you're in Charleston and you look at these values, sometimes, especially if you see quick changes in the maps that you see, just remember this can shift. So little changes in the track can bring some of those higher amounts in either direction depending on the track. So you might think you're out of the woods when you look at these maps, but guess what? You're not, because things could change. That's why we urge people really pay attention, because when these forecasts are updated, guess what? Some of the impacts could be too.